A new episode of the worst movie to game tie-ins today, making this part 3 in this series with many more to come in the future. Many have wondered how I managed to cope with some of the worst games ever put to cartridge, disc or cassette tape. The simple answer is I don't cope. I play most of these games with computing history in mind and upload them as a reference to how awful publishers once were. There was a time where anything which went to the cinema normally ended up getting a game, and it truly didn't matter how terrible or how unfinished it was. You likely, just like many others around the world, truly felt sucked in, that you either just wasted your paper round money or was saving for a little while to get conned into buying a game that was advertised like the best thing since sliced bread. To actually get a game that disappointed you so much that you have never forgotten about how bad it was. For me, personally, Robocop on the C64 was the most disappointing due to its bug. So we have another 10 god-awful games that should have never been even considered to be a game in the first place, or should simply have never been released, full stop. I swear, the more of these games that I play, the worse they are becoming, and there truly is some stinkers in today's part 3 of the worst movie games tie-ins ever. I think having a game based on Beethoven is just testament to those attempting cash grabs on big films, and of course the original Beethoven film in '92 was a fairly successful film. The 80s and 90s in cinema seen its fair share of dogs being used as the main stars of the show, K9, Turner and Hooch, and to some extent these films were generally good cheesy family fun and nothing else. So why on earth would you even consider turning the gigantic St. Bernard into a game? It just doesn't really work at all, and I honestly believe that High-Tech Expressions, who released this game, actually titled as Beethoven the Ultimate K9 Caper, likely knew that this game was terrible, but never mind the people who paid good money for this game at the time, it's Beethoven and that's all that matters, simply. I will also remind you here that although the box art for this game doesn't mention it being a sequel of the original film, we sure realise this when the game boots up. As you can see, it's no longer Ultimate K9 Caper, but rather Beethoven's second. Now, clearly Beethoven's sprite is just way too big for this game. I understand fully that Beethoven was a big dog in the film, but they could have easily shrunk the size of the sprite easily enough to do. The size is a big problem, and controlling it is terrible too. It's not that Buttons doesn't respond at all, it's just ridiculously clunky, and it's hard to avoid things due to the size of Beethoven. What makes it even more difficult to control is the fact that Beethoven actually slides. If you notice, when I let go of D-pad, Beethoven slides just like he is on ice of some kind. Now, if we want to kill cats and other domestic animals and even humans, we can bark at them generally around 3 or 4 times and they will just go up in a puff of smoke. There are bones scattered around the levels, which you might assume you could walk into and use them as energy of some kind, but no matter how many times I try to pick these up, nothing actually happens. Come Worlds 2, we can even jump on bouncing things to reach higher platforms. What did the development team honestly think? That this was going to be something like Sonic the Hedgehog? It's truly mind-boggling stuff. As for music, all you will hear is Roll Over Beethoven, which sounds terrible for a Super Nintendo game, or at least this version does. If you really feel the urge to play this game, then mute the sounds and play Electric Light Orchestra's Roll Over Beethoven. At least then you could partially have some fun playing this utter trash. An extremely bizarre exclusive game came to PlayStation 2 in 2006 with Beverly Hills Cop. Let's bear in mind that at this point Beverly Hills Cop was a huge success in cinema over 20 years prior to this Blast Entertainment release, which nobody frankly asked for. What makes it even stranger is that there were Beverly Hills Cop games in 1990, which actually spanned across multiple platforms, including the BBC Micro, the Amiga, and the ZX Spectrum. And to be fair, although those original games weren't really anything special, they were certainly superior to this utter nonsense. It just makes no sense in any way, shape or form. Interestingly, I mentioned the Beverly Hills Cop in the last video of this series, where Sylvester Stallone was originally to play what became Eddie Murphy's iconic Axel Foley character. Instead, Stallone went on to release Cobra. So, what is wrong with this game? Surely for a late PlayStation 2 release of 2006, and considering the PlayStation 3 was on the eve of releasing, this game should be looking good graphically at least. Well, it fails at pretty much everything it attempts. Like I said, it makes no sense whatsoever, to the point that even the box art for the game doesn't even show Eddie Murphy sitting on the car. You might think that we get the original Beverly Hills Cop theme music with this game. Well, no, what we do get though is a cheap 1980s sounding soundtrack, which is attempting to sound like the theme tune. At this point, one has to wonder even if Blast Entertainment even had the permission to even release this game. As the game loads up, we see imagery which looks like it's trying to copy something like Grand Theft Auto Vice City of some kind, and this concretes it when dying. We start the stage with some random man who looks nothing like Eddie Murphy whatsoever. I would likely say this man looks more like some kind of escaped convict who is desperately on the run for somebody. So we start the game where we need to avoid enemies and climb a ladder which leads us into a garage. The serious annoyance is that whilst outside, if an enemy sees us, we go right back to the start and have to suffer watching the cutscene all over again. And this gets very tiring very quickly. Being caught happens a fair amount here. What makes this even slower is that we can't actually run in this game. We get inside of the garage and we can then begin to shoot, or so I thought. I continuously shot an enemy, and after around 15 shots he actually finally dies, which I wasn't expecting. The most ridiculous thing is that below us inside this garage is hordes of people, and not one of them even attempts to shoot at us regardless of the noise we're making. I then begin shooting downwards at an enemy and nothing happens. Bullet marks appear and that's about all that happens, whilst an enemy appears to get stuck next to a car in some kind of weird bugged loop. I just don't get this game, and it gets even worse. Even if we die whilst inside of the garage, well, guess what? We literally have to go right back to the start of the game and watch the cutscene all over again. In general, the enemy AI in this game is some of the worst I've ever seen. Even if you shoot at somebody and a crowd of enemies are right next to you, they'll likely not move or even flinch or even come to investigate. I'll happily say at this point then, Beverly Hills Cop for a PlayStation 2 is probably one of the worst games on this system, if not the worst. If you was a big fan of Days of Thunder when it released in cinemas back in 1990 and was a gamer at the time, you likely would have been looking forward to taking on the role of Tom Cruise at home whilst waiting for some time for it to be released on VHS, as per usual for waiting for films to release on VHS back in those days. Days of Thunder released on many platforms at the time, mainly computers, although the Nintendo Entertainment System had a version too. Largely they were all different to the Amiga version, although that's not to say they were any better than this one. They were all fairly bad. Mindscape developed the Amiga version and a year later went on to develop the terrible Final Fight port, and a year after that they even did a worse job with Street Fighter 2 port. So yeah, not particularly the best team to be working on something on this scale in terms of 3D on an Amiga 500. If left in the capable hands, then a stock Amiga 500 was fairly capable of doing 3D. Robocop 3, for example, was a masterful production and extremely playable, and to date too. And in the same year as this release, Electronic Arts released Indianapolis 500, which is a superb 3D racing simulation game, and very well regarded too for its technical achievements. Then there is Days of Thunder, a pure slugfest with absolutely terrible sound effects to go with it. We actually have options at the start of the game to lower details in the game so it can run slightly faster, but honestly I really wouldn't bother. It runs as bad as the default high detail option. The game is so bad that it was actually on the Screen Gems pack on disc, which thankfully would have been more useful to wipe and copy something better onto it with Xcopy. It's a pure slugfest of a game that controls very bad too, and of course a racing game is nothing without speed. It's supposed to be fast. I mean, the frame rates here probably aren't much better than hard driving for the Commodore 64, and that's really saying something. No Escape is one of those films which was majorly hyped up at the time but ultimately failed, or at least had very mixed opinions at the time from film critics, whereas quality and substance when it released in cinemas back in 1994. Ray Liotta starred in this film, which at this point was very well known for his amazing performance as Henry in Goodfellas, and that was perhaps one of the greatest Scorsese's films ever made. I think Ray Liotta was typecast as a gangster actor at this point, and having him star as an action star didn't really make much sense. Of course, times were changing, and the face of the 1980s action style, being muscle madness and bodybuilding looks, was beginning to look dated in all fairness. I think likely Bruce Willis made this look old-fashioned in Die Hard. The film then is pretty much a sci-fi action film set in the near future where prisoners are seen as assets. Ray Liotta is the star of the film and shoots down bad guys. You know the score. We have the Mega Drive game here, and it starts off incredibly bad. From the get-go, we are bombarded with enemies in gangs, and by attacking them, normally we just come off the worst here. We can often collect health though, but really, your best bet is just to try and flee them altogether, as hit collision detection is very atrocious, and so the game being fair isn't there from square one. Level design is very bad, and there are jumps that we need to make to reach other platforms, but just seems that the length and height of jumping was designed really badly, and so jumping from platform to platform often sees us falling into pits, whilst gangs then bombard us once again whilst we're in the pit, depleting health very quickly. No Escape released for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive, and dare I say it, but legendary publishers Psygnosis released this trash back in 1994. If you know much about Stallone's film history, you'll know that the 1990s wasn't particularly his greatest decades for massive successful films like he enjoyed in the 1970s and 1980s. Good examples of this being the very poorly received Judge Dredd in 1995, Stop or My Mum Will Shoot in 1992, and finally Rocky V in 1990. It was a bad film to end such a great franchise with, in all fairness, but Cliffhanger was one of those films which was a massive success, and for good reason too. It is a solid action film releasing in 1993 that moved the typical city and decay theme and instead did it in Colorado's Rockies. A few different versions of Cliffhanger were released at the time, including a beat-em-up style for the Super Nintendo, but although most of these games were fairly bad, the NES version, in my opinion, is the very worst of them all. It's a totally infuriating play. Firstly, I don't really need to say it because it's obvious to most, but this game looks terrible. Generally, NES games had a standard to meet Nintendo's requirements to release games officially, but there are oddities like this one that released, and by no means is this a quality game, and not just because of how it looks. We control Gabe in this game, and when I say control, I mean try to control. The controls are just awful. In this game, we tend to punch more the Rocky Mountains wildlife than we do baddies. We of course need to jump from ledges to progress further, and this is where you will begin to lose patience very earlier on in the game. You need to literally jump precisely to another platform in many cases. If you don't, you'll often fall to your death and have to start from scratch at the start of the level. It's just hopeless at times. You'll likely find yourself dying over and over just trying to reach other platforms. I repeatedly attempted to grab the rope on the very first stage, and using a various range of different button combinations, I couldn't do it. And in fact, it was that annoying that I actually looked up a walkthrough guide to see if I was doing it correctly, which I was. Grab the rope. It turns out that you need to jump at exactly the right spot to grab this rope. Weirdly enough, with this game, when the levels start, you have to wait a good few seconds to actually start playing the game. Gabe just doesn't move at all. The music is fairly bad too. It's the same loop pretty much all the way through. Probably the only good thing about this NES version is the storyline animations at the start of the game. But really, you might as well just turn it off and just watch the film. I'll be honest with you, I have never heard of the film Surf Ninjas before, and it's very likely the film on most accounts seemed to be that it flopped big time when it released in 1993. It actually lost money at the box office rather than profiting at all. New Line Cinema released this one, the distribution company put together to release Nightmare on Elm Street. This family film though just didn't impress much, and it's strange as the casting wasn't bad with this film. Rob Schneider, Leslie Nielsen, and even Ernie Reyes Jr., who did the stunts for Donatello and the first two feature-length Turtles films. After reading what this film was about, it's pretty much a cheesy martial arts comedy about two teenage surfers who find out they are actually two crown princes from the fantasy Asian kingdom known as Putasan. The Surf Ninjas then take on an evil ruling colonel, so of course it was a no-brainer for software publishers to grab an action-based film and turn it into a game. This is of course the Amiga CD32 version, although there was an Amiga 1200 version of this game too. There was also a Sega Game Gear version with a Mega Drive game planned too, but that ultimately got scrapped. Randomly, Sega actually and partially financed this film, and so thought, let's just make a game regardless of how terrible it might be. So for the Amiga versions, Microvalue released these in 1994, and to refresh your minds, Microvalue also released Ninja Rabbits, another poor Commodore 64 and Amiga game. Is this an improvement over Ninja Rabbits, which they released a few years prior? Well, Surf Ninjas actually makes Ninja Rabbits seem like Streets of Rage in comparison. Now honestly, I thought my controller was in the wrong port originally, as controls were so bad. I suddenly realised they were actually in the correct port. This game has probably got the worst collision detection I've ever reviewed or played. We can throw flying kicks at other ninjas, and many times it just doesn't register that a hit collision has occurred, and the same with punching enemies too. There doesn't actually even appear to be a need to even hit enemies, as we can progress onto new screens without even doing so. At the start screen we have an option of music or sound effects. I chose music, and it included music and sound effects together. So what's the point of even asking which you prefer, because they're both included in the game anyways. I eventually walked to a man who was asking for boxes. I thought this was a beat 'em up game. It's all very confusing. I mean, really, this game is just so bad in every way. Like I said, it kind of makes Ninja Rabbit seem as good as Streets of Rage. And as for the character you play as in this game, well, like I said, I've never seen the film before, but I would have thought it was going to be playing as a younger person. Instead, we have some old dude. It's all truly really bizarre. If you're enjoying the content today, please like and subscribe, and also remember to hit that notifications bell and select all so you don't miss upcoming content. This channel also has a wealth of emulation tutorials, including standalone and front-end guides. Just Jamie is your ultimate go-to channel for everything retro related. Anyways, for now, on with the video. As a kid who loved Enter the Dragon and those awesome moves that Bruce Lee pulled off, when Dragon the Bruce Lee story became available to rent around 1994, this was a no-brainer for me. I thought this film was awesome and must have watched it a few times before returning it back to the corner shop when I rented it out. I ended up buying it on VHS soon after. Regardless of how inaccurate it is in terms of being a story of Bruce Lee's life, it was a great action film. My personal favourite scene being the alleyway scene as Bruce takes on the kitchen staff. Today, I still see this as smile away at the pure amazing moves seen in this film, combined with the classic 1960s Green Onions track. Of course, I was sucked into buying the game for the Super Nintendo at the time, but always found it ridiculously difficult and entirely forgettable, which was a real shame. This could have been really a superb one-on-one beat-em-up game, but failed on every level. The game of the film was released on several platforms between 1994 and 1995, including the Mega Drive, Game Gear, but this particular version is being played on the doomed Atari Jaguar console. So firstly, I think the game looks fairly impressive here. It's not bad at all, especially the sprites and their movements. Everything looks very faithful to the film, including the first fight, which is taken from the film itself. Problem is, and a very annoying problem, is the controls in collision detection. Your average one-on-one beat-em-up can have you winning a single round in a minute or less, providing we have a good range of moves as well as special moves, and also by having quality hit detection. And this is where Dragon the Bruce Lee story epically fails. Although Bruce Lee jumping around looks pretty impressive, it's a real shame that hitting enemies do very little damage. You'll also find yourself getting annoyed very quickly as you'll start realising that hitting the opponent barely touches their health bar. In addition to his main story mode, we also have a battle mode where we can just select a stage and fight against yourself. Bruce Lee, that is. Very odd. We have most of the iconic backdrops here, including the alleyway, the set of Big Boss, and also the set from Enter the Dragon, which some very strange techno music is in the background of them all. The controls in general are very clunky. It's just really poorly executed and makes a game that had plenty of potential to be good do the exact opposite. A single fight in this game can last for a good few minutes and you'll find yourself jumping around trying your best to quickly take on opponents. It doesn't happen, and this game is flawed in many ways. Back in the day, I pretty much watched and owned every Arnold Schwarzenegger film on VHS, even those more obscure films like Red Sonja, which aren't really talked about much anymore. The Running Man was definitely one of my favourites and depicted a dystopian future where prisoners appeared on a profitable game show known as The Running Man. For making out alive, your prize was freedom. In some ways, The Running Man reminds me of Smash TV, which was an awesome game in the early 90s. The Running Man, though, was one of those typical over-the-top Arnold Schwarzenegger sci-fi action flicks, which is probably best remembered for its pure 1980s cheesiness. But nevertheless, although these days it does admittedly look dated, it's still a superb film, and originally, although it wasn't necessarily a box office super smash, it did manage to break even financially and definitely gained a cult following over the years. You might be also interested to know that at some point this year a remake is due to be released with an entire new cast. Hopefully this won't be as bad as some reboots that we get. Who knows? So as far as the games then, they all released in 1989 by Grand Slam Entertainments on the popular 8-bit and 16-bit home computers at the time. It's generally the case that games based on films are released in the same year, but not in this case. This game released just over 2 years after the film came out. Before I talk about how terrible this game is, developers Emerald Software, who developed a few other notoriously bad Commodore 64 games, such as Moonwalker the video game, which actually I covered in the previous bad film to game tie-ins video, they also did a terrible arcade port of Vigilante. The thing what makes The Running Man so terrible to play is the absolute atrocious controls and hit collision detection. We play as Arne's character Ben, and he walks incredibly slow here and kinda looks strange too as he does so. We can make him run by pressing right or left once and then quickly pressing again. He can jump, and jumping is part of the main issue here. We need to jump over obstacles, and you need to be in the precise position, otherwise he just jumps backwards awkwardly, and he does this when walking into something, which gets very frustrating. By the time we take on the main baddies, aka the stalkers, hitting them is easy enough. Killing them takes a long time as hit collision detections are just so bad. We can kill dogs to give us energy, and we get to listen to a fairly annoying loop of a random song whilst all this annoyance is happening all together. We even get some kind of random puzzle elements to this game, which to my knowledge isn't a thing in the film itself. And if all of this wasn't enough, the graphics are very ugly and very blocky for a 1989 C64 game. It's a fairly short game, only this seems to take a lot longer to play, as it can take a very long time taking down stalkers due to the bad collision detection. Back to the Future games are no stranger in this series. We have previously covered Back to the Future 3, as well as the shoddy game for the original film for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Back to the Future Part 2 is my personal favourite of the trilogy, and sadly, fans of the franchise also got some very shoddy games to go with it. There truly was no hope for a decent Back to the Future game in the 80s and 90s. Legend has it, even Christopher Lloyd seen the quality of these games back in the day, and even said it that the quality of these games were so bad that I urged him to say "Great Scott" at some point. Yes, they truly were diabolical enough for Christopher Lloyd to use his character's iconic line to describe them all in just 2 single words. The major 8-bit and 16-bit computers of the day had a version of the game, although this Sega Master System release was the only console at the time to receive a version. Imageworks released it in 1990, and dear lord, this game is likely as frustrating as Back to the Future Part 3 on the Mega Drive. Controlling Marty on the hoverboard is just horrible. What makes this a little confusing is that by pressing the action button, Marty gives an animation or impression that he is able to hit Griff and his gang. But although I tried doing this whilst playing the first stage, there was no indication as to if he was actually hitting or giving any damage to any of the gang members. The most irritating thing about Back to the Future 2 on Master System is that if we collide with another sprite, energy very quickly depletes and it's an instant back to the start game. I will say though that Marty on the hoverboard isn't the only style of gameplay with this release. We get other ridiculous fillers with this version just to pack the game out, almost like a primitive version of a mini games package. We have ridiculous puzzle elements to this game and other bits and pieces which randomly don't particularly fit together, but honestly I had enough of the first stage after just a couple of minutes. I should really do a dedicated Back to the Future games video at some point and rank them all from worst to worst. Possibly one of Robin Williams' most obscure films. This is Toys, which released in '92. It is considered as a surreal comedy, hence the absolute bizarreness of it all. For Jamie Foxx fans, this was actually his debut film, and to star alongside Robin Williams, well, any aspiring actor would jump at the chance. Toys was and still is one of those types of films you either love or hate. It was a massive commercial failure in its day, losing around $25 million. Just like any film that flopped in its day, they generally adopt a cult following like this one's done through the years. The Mega Drive and Super Nintendo both received a game of the film, in which Absolute Entertainment released them both back in '93. A strange game to release by 1993 in that the film was a huge commercial failure. So what would make a game of Toys better than the film itself? Well, absolutely nothing at all. In fact, the game and the film probably got a more negative bunch of reviews on release than the film did itself, and for good reason too. The games are extremely very poor, and what would you expect from the same development team who brought us the terrible game of Home Alone 2 Lost in New York? We can expect a fairly annoying game with annoying level design, terrible weapons, and sprites that move so quickly it is hard to shoot at them with the bunch of ridiculous weapons that we have to use. Legend has it that we can actually get a better shot at enemies in this game by lining up bowling balls with the lines on the floor in order to shoot at tanks and other random toys that are out to kill you. The objective of the first stage is very strange. It tells us at the start to take down security cameras. What it doesn't actually tell you is that you first need to destroy certain toys before you can actually do this. What makes this game so bad is the sporadic movement of enemies and the speeds they are travelling at. Using the various weapons that we get here are so bad I need to wait a couple of seconds before your weapons actually take effect. Like I said, this game is extremely poorly designed in every way conceivable. It's a truly horrible play which offers no fun and no real reason to ever play it again. And that's it for another 10 of the worst movie to games tie-ins today. So did you necessarily agree with part 3 today? Which game did you suffer with back in the day? Drop us a comment in the comment section and let's hear some horror stories of your experiences with some of these games in this video. Until next time, stay retro.